you wouldn't get this conversation on CNN or Fox, either one. The conversation we're having where I'm saying, you need to listen to what he has to say before you make up your mind.
We find that I have a big conversion rate when people actually listen to me.
As we enter the heart of the 2024 presidential race, RFK Jr. aims to do what no third-party candidate has ever done: win the presidency. Will we have another Kennedy in the White House, or will he tip the scales towards either former President Trump or President Biden? This is a pivotal moment in American politics, reminiscent of those rare occasions when a third-party candidate shook up the status quo. Just a few weeks ago, I sat down with President Donald Trump, and tonight I'll dive into where RFK Jr. stands in one of the highest stakes elections of our lifetime. With RFK Jr. polling around 10% nationally and people's disenchantment with both Trump and Biden, could he be the wild card no one saw coming? How do you like to be addressed?
Robert,
Great.
I watched your show with President Trump. It was really good. The best I've ever seen him presenting himself. I think you brought out the best in him.
That was my plan. Robert, I'm very proud to sit down with you, by the way. And I do try to be a different kind of interviewer. I'm not a politician. I don't know squat about politics, nor do I desire to. I'm certainly not some kind of gotcha interviewer. Being from a psychological background and dealing with psychosocial issues, I try to go at these things from a different standpoint. And you can probably predict my first question, which will be very, very predictable. I hope your answer is not. I've spent a lot of my time professionally. I was in the litigation arena, which I know you've got great expertise in. I spent a lot of time preparing CEOs of Fortune 100 companies to testify. And I know about having their 4 talking points and pivoting back to those. And I know how politicians go about it. I know you have things that you cover when you're on the campaign trail. And I hope, like I did with President Trump, for people to get to know a side of you that maybe they don't get to see every day. You're in a run for the president of the United States. And my first question is why? Certainly from a third-party perspective, the odds have got to be long. So why are you doing it?
It wasn't something that I was sitting around thinking, I got to do this someday. I have a really good life. I have an amazing family, and I have a job where I'm very effective and where I was having fun at and making a good living. But I saw something happening to my country that I couldn't really imagine. I saw this huge division that's so toxic now, so poisonous. When I lived through the 1960s, when my father ran for president at a time of great division, but I don't think we've seen anything like this since the American Civil War. And it's all amplified by the social media algorithms that are pushing us farther and farther into our positions, into these kind of tribal positions. But the origin of it is I believe, the capture of our political parties by corporate interests and the corruption that's come from that. And the political parties are fueling that fire. I think this presidential campaign will cost about $15 billion. And that money is coming from these big corporations and this new kind of oligarchy of billionaires. And when they donate the money, they expect something in return. And it's transformed the political parties away from democracy. Their function is to advance the mercantile interests of the corporations that are funding them. And
is that true on both sides, Democrat and Republican?
Yeah, and a lot of times it's the same company as BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the defense contractors, an oil company and a coal company, and a tobacco company, and the arms companies are more likely to give to the Republican Party. And then, there's a whole slew of the pharmaceutical companies are more likely to give to the Democrats. But they're both owned by, interests that are not necessarily America's interests. And I felt I was in a unique position to talk about this because I've spent my entire career, 40 years, suing agencies and large polluters and the agencies that they've now captured. I've sued almost all of them. I've sued EPA as much as any other attorney. I've sued CDC, NIH, FDA, the public health agencies, the FCC, the USDA. And when you do this litigation, you get a PhD in corporate capture and how to unravel it. I also felt like I had a clarity of vision about what this country is supposed to look like. And I feel like I'm in a unique position to see how far it departed from those values.
Historically, third-party candidates are not successful. So are you the exception? And if not, what's the end game? What's your ultimate goal? Can you win?
I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I could win. We're in a unique time in American history now where we have the two least popular candidates running. We have between 70 and 80% of the American public saying they don't want that choice, that they want a different choice. I'm in a position, though, an independent candidate has been in history. All the polls that have shown me in a two-way race against President Trump show me beating him. All the polls that show me in a two-way race against President Biden show me beating him in a landslide. And, the Zogby poll is the biggest poll taken, and it shows me beating President Biden in a head-to-head race, winning 39 states and him only winning 11. I beat President Trump on a very, very narrow margin, but President Biden can't beat him. And there's never been an independent candidate who's been in that strong a position before.
Do you think President Biden is going to be the candidate for the Democrats?
I don't know. I think it's hard to imagine, but I think...
if they don't run him, who will they run?
I don't know. I stopped predicting the future in 2016 when President Trump won because I didn't think that was going to happen. And I just thought, okay, I'm not good at this. So I stopped.
Yeah, well, reading people the way I do, because it's my profession, I predicted with total confidence that he had the message, but he was not the messenger. I said, 100% he won't be elected. I said, you count on it. I know these things. Trust me. I was 100% wrong.
Yeah, my daughter, I have a daughter who never thinks about politics. She has nothing to do with it. And she came to me at the beginning of 2016. She said, Donald Trump's going to be the next president. And I said, you're crazy. You don't know anything. But
well, you're bringing up family. So let's talk about that elephant in the room, because your family has not endorsed your presidential candidacy. In fact, they've said in part, your siblings, Rory, Carrie, Kathleen, Joseph, put out a statement on X that said in part, the decision of our brother Bobby to run as a third-party candidate against Joe Biden is dangerous to our country. Bobby might share the same name as our father, but he does not share the same values, vision, or judgment. Today's announcement is deeply saddening for us. We denounce his candidacy and believe it is perilous for our country. And then others went on to say, we cannot do anything that in any way strips even one vote from President Biden. You put the Kennedy name on the ballot, and Democrats are going to feel torn. They also said they love you personally as an individual, but not your candidacy. How did you feel when you read all? Did you know that was coming?
Yeah, I knew it was coming. And, I have a big family, Dr. Phil. I think there's something like 105 cousins, and a lot of them are supporting me. Several of them who are working prominently in my campaign. My cousin Anthony Shriver, who is helping run my campaign in Florida, and he has a daughter who, until recently, was in the senior staff level of my campaign. But, my family, listen, we were raised to differ with each other on issues. My father orchestrated debates between us every night at the dinner table, and they differ with me on a lot of issues. They differed with me on COVID, on the lockdowns, for example. They differ with me on the Ukraine war. And my family has a very close relationship with President Biden. So President Biden has a bust of my father behind him at the Oval Office. I've known President Biden for 40 years. It's not just a political friendship with my family, it's a personal friendship. They actually like him a lot, and they're very loyal to him. And 5 of them, including some of the ones that you mentioned, actually work for or with the administration. So I understand their distress, but I love my family. I feel loved by my family, and I feel like I can argue with them in a way that is congenial, that is spirited, but at the same time, I'm able to love them. I wish that for the rest of the country too. I wish that we could have civil debate again without hating each other.
I wonder if people think, I don't know Robert Kennedy Jr., but the people who do know him are saying really biting and critical things about him. They know him better than I do, so who am I to second guess them? They know him better. Was that their intent? Did they really intend to torpedo your campaign? Because as an outsider looking in, from a psychological standpoint, I think people would say, I'm going to substitute their judgment for mine because they know him better than I do. How do you keep people from substituting this judgment for their own?
There's an entire national press out there that is very opposed to me. What I would say to people is just listen to what I'm saying rather than other people's characterizations of me. And that's the most I can do. I know that what I'm doing right now is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I feel comfortable in my soul with that decision. And I'm working as hard as I can to make sure that to save this country. But ultimately, it's in God's hands. I have to work as hard as I can. And the slings and arrows that I take from people outside are, need to be irrelevant to me.
Let me ask you this, and then I want to get on to some of the policies, because there's a lot of things you and I agree about, actually, and I look at it from the cultural standpoint. I think perception is reality. If people believe something to be true to them, that's reality. And I know that to be true psychologically. You have a lot of theories that are non-consensual. Would you agree with that? They're not widely held theories?
The way I would put it is that I'm willing to depart from orthodoxies if I don't believe the evidence supports those orthodoxies.
I don't want to go into them because you've talked about them a lot of places, and I'm happy to put links up to every quality place that you've talked about them that you would like me to, but you've talked about vaccines, Wi-Fi waves that cross the blood barrier of the brain and break down the mitochondria of the cells, massive increase in school shootings subsequent to pharmas pushing antidepressants like Prozac, chemicals in the water contributing to sexual dysphoria, I assume gender dysphoria in kids, primarily boys, that the election in 2004 was basically stolen, that Bill Gates' 5G networks constitute a mass surveillance system. They're not consensual, they're not widely held. I don't want to go into them now. Like vaccines, for example, you had a great conversation with my good friend Joe Rogan about that, and I'll put that link up so people can listen to it if they want to. Do you have a perception problem? People hear it and say, that's crazy conspiracy theory, but they don't really listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, you kind of put me in a bad position to rattle off a bunch of things I've supposedly said without giving the basis for, what I was saying. And let me just give you an example. The connection between atrazine, which is a chemical that is in about 63% of America's water supply, that there has been an increase in gender dysphoria in this country, and that we should be looking at reasons for that. There's been a series of studies, including one by a very famous scientist called Tyler Hayes at the University of Berkeley, published in the National Academy of Sciences journal, in which he took about 100 frogs, it may have been 70, and subjected them to atrazine at the levels that EPA considers safe. They were all male frogs. And 70% of those frogs became chemically castrated. 10% of the male frogs turned female and began producing fertile eggs. I've been working on endocrine disruptors, which are classes of chemicals like PCBs that I've been working on for 40 years that affect sexual development. It's not a theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's well documented. So what I said in that case is, I don't know if it's affecting gender dysphoria. I don't know if atrazine is, but isn't it something that we ought to study? Another thing you mentioned is the school shootings. When the Columbine shooting happened, I think 5 families brought lawsuits against the maker of Prozac, which had just been released. But there have been many, many articles since then, and a lot of evidence that some of these mass shootings that we're seeing in this country may be related to these new class of drugs, of SSRIs and benzos. Those drugs have a black box warning on them that says they cause homicidal and suicidal behavior. We take 120 million doses of SSRIs.
That's actually not what it says. It doesn't say they cause homicidal and suicidal behavior. It says they can put people at risk for those behaviors. It doesn't say it causes them. It says it can.
Okay, I thought I qualified it in that way, but you're correct.
Because I am an expert on that, and I am an expert on school shooters, and that is not a factor in that. But my point is not, are you correct or not? And for people who are rolling their eyes when you talk about frogs and then jump, no pun intended, to humans, comparative science is a very valid science, and that's how we get a lot of the discoveries that we do. I'm not taking issue with that at all. My question is, do you have a perception problem because people would form conclusions because on its face it sounds crazy, it sounds like a conspiracy theory? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, do you have a perception
that
problem?
Question is yes, I do have a perception problem.
And you say I'm putting you in a bad position. I'm trying to clear it up because I see the difference. Like I say, comparative science is a valid thing to consider. And I disagree with some of the things. I think people who say that vaccines today cause autism, I would disagree with that. You're vaccinated, your children are vaccinated, you're talking about mercury accumulation and all which has really been turned down in vaccines, and there are a lot of ways to get around this. Your position is not that radical. You're not putting people at risk with your position. We have ADD in America. We read headlines and we don't listen to the rest of it. I want to be somebody that stimulates people to say, hey, slow down and don't read the headline, read the story. Find out what he actually says about this before you make a decision. So if it's awkward to hear, it's because I think you have a perception problem, but I think the perception can be corrected if people will just take just a little time to hear what you actually say.
You're a podcast listener, and this is a podcast ad. Reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Lips and Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a reproduced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience with Lips and Ads. Go to lipsandads.com now. That's LIBSYN ads.com.
Yeah, and I have a perception problem, particularly in the mainstream media. I do very well, Phil, with kids. I'm beating President Trump and President Biden in Americans under 35 in the battleground states. There's a recent poll that has me beating President Trump and President Biden with Americans under 45 because they're listening to long form interviews and they're not getting their news exclusively from the mainstream media. So they hear the longer explanation. They actually hear what I'm saying rather than the mischaracterizations of what I supposedly said.
You stand by what you say. You stand by your positions, correct?
Yes.
And you have explanations for them. Agree with it or disagree with it, but hear what I have to say. Don't just judge me because you think, well, that's some kooky theory. You do your homework. And I disagree with some of your conclusions. Some of them I agree with wholeheartedly. But I've taken the time to hear what you have to say. It's informed. You have a basis for what you say. It's all 100% good faith. And I think most people would change their opinion if they would take the time to listen.
Yeah, I think so too.
The mainstream media doesn't cover you the way you want to be covered. I speak to their audience. And that's why I started Mara Street Media. That's why I do what I do and have as big an audience as I have across all the platforms, because they can get from me what they don't get from the mainstream media. I want to tell them what they don't get about Robert Kennedy Jr., because you wouldn't get this conversation on CNN or Fox, either one. The conversation we're having where I'm saying you need to listen to what he has to say before you make up your mind.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, we find that I have a big conversion rate when people actually listen to me. As you say, I have a perception problem.
Yeah.
And one of my challenges in this election is that the mainstream media, the NBC, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, and CBS, won't allow me on to do a live interview. Most of them won't even allow a taped interview. But I've only done one live interview on CNN, but otherwise they won't let me on to do that.
Why do you think that is? What are they afraid of?
Well, I think there is a political alignment now with the media. They're overtly either Democrat or Republican. And I think the Democratic-oriented networks, they feel like I'm going to be a threat to President Biden if I'm even allowed on the air. And there's other more complex motives. One is, they get so much of their revenue from pharmaceutical interests. Roger Ailes was very supportive of me. He was the founder of Fox News.
Mm-hmm. I knew him well.
And I came to him in 2014 with a documentary that I helped create about mercury in vaccines. And I showed it to him, and he was completely persuaded by this documentary. But he said, I can't let you get on to talk about it because we get 70% of our revenues in the evening news shows come from the pharmaceutical companies. I think all the networks are under that kind of pressure.
Let me ask you this about Big Pharma, and this is about vaccines. You say that the government regulators have been bought off by Big Pharma. I think that's what you're saying when you say that this entanglement has occurred. You said agency employees are actually getting royalties, getting payments on vaccines and drugs that they approve. Is that true?
Yes, there's a couple of things happening with FDA. About 50% of FDA's budget comes from regulated industries, so mainly the pharmaceutical industries. You have agency capture on steroids. The principal objective of FDA today is to serve the mercantile interests of pharmaceutical companies. And that's why you see FDA not only approving all of these drugs that shouldn't be approved, but they also are, out to destroy things that are actually shown to be good for you that do not make profits for the pharmaceutical companies. But then the agency I was talking about in the quote that you just cited is NIH. And in 1980, we passed a law called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Bayh-Dole Act, for the first time, allowed individual scientists and NIH as the agency to collect royalties on drugs on which they had done research. So, it really transformed, that law transformed NIH. When I was growing up, NIH was only 15 minutes from my home. And my mother had a secretary who was married to a scientist who worked there. And I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid. So I went to NIH all the time to look at the rats and look through the microscopes, et cetera. It was the premier scientific agency in the world. All the other countries, nobody in the world had anything like that. And they would look to America for science, and particularly for medical research, biomedical research. Well, after the Bayh-Dole Act, NIH began slowly migrating from a scientific research agency to a drug development incubator. And I think in 2016, and I may get these numbers wrong, but I think that year there were about 220 new drugs approved by FDA. and 100% of them came out of NIH. For example, the Moderna vaccine, NIH owns half of that vaccine, 50%. So the billions of dollars that vaccine makes, half of that goes to NIH, the agency, but there's also individuals, at least 4, and maybe 6 individuals who work for NIH who are high-level deputies under Anthony Fauci who get to collect $150,000 a year forever, not just for their lives, but their children. As long as that mRNA technology is on the market, they're going to be making money from it.
Okay.
And that is a conflict.
Hang on a minute now, because I don't want to blow by this too fast. So the National Institute of Health is getting a kickback, a bribe, a royalty, a share, whatever you want to call it. Is this not a clear conflict of interest?
Yes.
That's what you're pointing out, right?
Yeah, it is. People are shocked.
Why are you the only one talking about this?
If you talk about this kind of thing, you get censored on YouTube. You will not be allowed on the mainstream media to talk about these issues. It used to be that you could, and nowadays you cannot.
If there's some rational reason for it, then why would they try to censor and hide it?
I think it was an idealistic reason. This was, 1980, right? It was the time of the Reagan Revolution. If you put privatized incentives into the government agencies, that they would function better and more efficiently.
Yeah, but it's always the right time to do the right thing. And by the way, they can't get emergency approval for these things if there's a treatment available, you've also pointed out.
The whole approval of the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccines during COVID required them to suppress any other therapeutic drugs that may have been effective against COVID. And a lot of people believe, including myself, that there were therapeutics that were very, very effective against COVID, like ivermectin, like hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, and many, many others, and that they were deliberately suppressed because the government wanted to issue these emergency use authorizations, and it would have been illegal if they acknowledged that there was an existing drug that was approved for any purpose that was effective against COVID.
It seems to me that that's another conflict of interest, that they have to suppress this to get their payday.
We had 16% of the COVID deaths in the United States, and we only have 4.2% of the world's population. So we literally did worse than any country in the world, at least by that data point. And I think one of the reasons was the systematic suppression of things that could have helped patients in hospitals all over the country and individuals who just got COVID. That everybody was directed down one path, and it was the path that was being dictated from above.
Biden referred to this at one point as, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Was he pushing these vaccinations for the wrong reasons? You probably know I took a very strong position about the mismanagement of this quarantine, about the mismanagement of this pandemic, about what it did to our young people. But they're pushing these vaccines on children who were not at high risk. This was not a lethal virus for them. They're pushing this on children. They're pushing it on pregnant mothers. And when there's a profit motive involved here, I spent a lot of my life trying to figure out why people do what they do and don't do what they don't do. Like, if somebody's selling me a car, if a mechanic's telling me this is sound, I want to know if he also owns the car, right? I mean, don't you want to know somebody's motives? And doesn't this call into question the motive? You're saying this should be transparent. We should know this if people are telling us this is what we should do. And oh, by the way, I make money every time you do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a useful quote by Upton Sinclair. It's almost impossible to convince a man of a fact if the existence of that fact will diminish his salary. It's just common sense that we want to know, we want to eliminate conflicts of interest, so that particularly among government officials, so that you know that they're acting on behalf of the public welfare and they don't have a private stake in their decision.
Did you say the COVID vaccine was the deadliest vaccine ever approved?
Well, it was the deadliest in terms of how many deaths were reported to the VAERS database. Now, you don't know causation. I took the vaccine and the next day I had a heart attack or a stroke or myocarditis. you can't say for sure that that injury was attributable to that.
It was
intervention.
correlational, not causative,
Right.
but it still occurs together.
When you see this huge uptick within, I think, the first year of the release of the COVID vaccine, there were more reports to COVID of deaths and injuries than all vaccines put together for the previous almost 36 years. So in that sense, yeah, it was the deadliest vaccine ever. And, part of that is that it was mandated for so many people.
One of your key focus points is to unravel the corporate capture of government agencies and the corporate capture of health agencies. How do you achieve that?
Well, that's a good question. I think each agency you have to address on its, because they all have unique structures. Part of the problem is policy and structure, and part of it is personnel. If there are perverse incentives, like at FDA, where 50% of the budget comes from pharma or NIH, where regulators are getting paid to make sure that drugs get on the market, Congress actually had hearings on it. And Anthony Fauci testified at those hearings because he was making money on some of these, drugs that he had developed. So you have a scientist who is supposed to be looking for problems in that drug. That's what his job is as a regulator, find the problems to make sure you're protecting the public. But if he's paying for his mortgage and he's paying for his children's education, he's paying for his boat, he's paying for his alimony from that $150,000 a year, you could expect and you could predict that he's going to be less vigilant about finding problems. That's what we call a perverse incentive, and those needed to be undone. Because of the revolving door at the top of these agencies, the people who tend to get promoted are people who are willing to carry water for the industry. The regulators become sock puppets of the industry, and when people get to the end of their careers for a government agency, they go work for the industries they regulated. So right before they leave, they tend to do a lot of favors for those industries and their senior management. And that example, that bad example, tends to percolate downward throughout their whole division.
And then they go across the street and work for who they were regulating.
Yeah. So when you do that, you can't drain the swamp. These are all swamp creatures. Mm-hmm. And it amplifies that corporate capture that we see, happening anyway at the lower level. But you can clean it out. And I understand the perverse incentives that need to be changed right away in order to change agency culture and get them doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is to be serving the public interest and protecting public health. We're now the unhealthiest country in the world. Yeah. We have the highest chronic disease burden in the world. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, almost 60% do. And nobody's doing anything about this. Nobody's talking about it. The autism rates in my generation, depending on which study, 1 in 2,500 or 1 in 10,000. In my kids' generation, it's 1 in every 34 kids, 1 in every 22 boys. So Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. EPA came back and said, it's a red line, 1989. And so something happened in 1989. We know this epidemic is not happening because of genes. Genes don't cause epidemics, as you know. You need an environmental toxin. So why are we looking for what toxin it was that hit every demographic, became ubiquitous in 1989? And those are the studies that I'm going to get them to do as president.
Well, let's talk about becoming president. Do we have a problem in this country with election integrity?
Yes.
And what is the problem?
The problem is that machines can be hacked. And by the way, this has become a partisan issue recently where the Republicans are complaining about it and the Democrats aren't. But 5 years ago, it was the opposite. I mean, every Democrat believed in his heart and in his head that the 2001 election was stolen from Al Gore. I wrote an award-winning article showing how the 2004 election was also tampered with. Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders followers believe that it was stolen from him in 2016, and Hillary Clinton's publicly said it was stolen from her in 2020 in the Atlanta Monthly. So both sides are complaining about it, and we ought to be able to fix it. We put a man on the moon. We have ATMs on every corner in every city, and they never miscount. They never give you more money than you want.
What do you think about the fact that all of a sudden, and it seems all of a sudden to me, maybe it's not, we have ballot harvesting where people are going around and collecting ballots. What happened to just having elections where people show up and vote? If somebody's infirm, absolutely okay. Don't put resistance in front of people. But now it seems like it's just wholesale. How do you oversee that? It just seems like it's ripe for fraud as opposed to where you have someone overseeing it.
Yeah, and we need to fix that. And it's easy to fix. You need to have paper ballots. And you need a low threshold for a recount so that if anybody says, that there was a problem here, you need to, it triggers a recount and a right to a recount. The other thing, I'm going to do this when I get into office. One of the big issues that separate all this is happening, Phil, because of the divide. Everybody knows that we need a election system that all Americans have total faith in, that above anything else. And when you cast your vote, it's going to be counted. We don't have that. We don't have it because Republicans and Democrats aren't sitting down with each other and saying, what do we need to do to make this happen? Instead, they're taking sides. And let me give you an idea of one of the solutions for this. One of the issues is voter ID. Democrats don't like voter ID and demand a requirement for voter ID at the voting booth. Why not? The reason for that is because there are tens of millions of people in this country who are eligible to vote, but they don't have government-issued photo ID. They don't have driver's licenses. Most of them are Democratic constituencies. They're elderly people whose licenses have expired. They're young students, and they're urban minorities who don't have a driver's license because they don't need one. And so what I'm going to do the day I get into office, I'm going to order the State Department and the Post Office to begin issuing passport cards to any American who can't afford them for free. The passport card is a government-issued photo ID. There's no vaccine information or medical information. It's just an ID. That's going to solve three huge problems. One, if you don't have a government-issued photo ID in this country, you are a second-class citizen. You can't open a bank account. You can't pick up your kids at school. You can't go to a hotel. You can't get on an airplane. Number two, if we had a government-issued photo ID, it would solve a lot of the problems of the border. Because right now,
sure would.
An employer is legally, it's criminally liable if they hire an undocumented immigrant. And then the third is the election integrity issue. So my team has reached out to civil rights leaders, leading civil rights leaders around the country, Al Sharpton, Andrew Young, and others, and said, if I issue this government-issued photo ID, will you withdraw your objection to demanding photo ID at the voting booth? And they've said yes. Problem solved.
Well, I agree. Then you're saying do that instead of having all these mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting.
Anything where there's a hole in election integrity, we got to get rid of it. We got to encourage as many people to vote.
Should we be concerned that almost a third of Americans, have a lack of confidence in votes are going to be counted?
For democracy, isn't it?
Yeah. Scott Rasmussen has done a poll, and he asked people the following, and this is really disturbing to me. The question was, is it okay to win an election by cheating? 7% of all Americans said yes. 35% of elites said yes. And that was defined by, they made $150,000 a year. They were urban dwellers and postgraduates. 69% said yes. If they made $150,000 a year, were urban dwellers, postgraduates who talked politics on a daily basis. 69% of those that were active in politics said, yeah, it was okay if my candidate had to cheat to win. You could knock me over with a feather. What the hell are people thinking?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I got a lot. But I got a lot of those kind of surprises during COVID because I learned how many people were okay with government censoring speech, with government closing down every church in this country, with government closing our schools when we're already having a mental health crisis with our kids.
The people that shut the schools down are the same people that collects data that told them we had the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness among young people since we had started keeping records. And they shut down the school systems, which is where those kids get their stimulation. It's where they learn to interact. It's where they do competition. And it's also where we have mandated reporters who keep their eyes on them and watch for abuse and sexual molestation. Yeah. And instead, we took those eyes off of those kids, sent them home behind closed doors, abandoning them to the very abusers that we were watching for, and referrals for that kind of care dropped to like 50% across the country.
It was the only indicia of social disintegration that actually improved because we stopped counting the abuse.
It just stopped getting reported that much.
It probably got worse.
Of course it did. We abandoned those kids to their abusers, and their answer from Fauci and others was, well, we're doing the best we can with what we know. No, they were not doing the best they can with what they knew. They had no plan to reopen the schools when they closed them down, and they just had a new hammer and everything looked like a nail. And so they just started shutting this business, shutting this school, shutting this, and the teachers' unions were wielding the power.
Well, there was a Brown University study that showed that during those lockdowns, there was a 22% drop in IQ among the youngest Americans. And then CDC, in 2023, revised its milestones. Prior to that, the milestone was that a kid should walk unassisted. That means without touching furniture at 12 months. They now are 18 months. The prior milestone was that children should have 50 words by 24 months, and now that's 30 months. So they're normalizing.
Just keep lowering the standards.
They're normalizing the harm that they did to our children.
And they're doing it in school. 30+% of fifth graders can't read a simple sentence. Almost 30% of eighth graders can't read a most fundamental sentence, and 19% of high school graduates can't read even the instructions on a prescription that they get at the drugstore. How are we continuing to pass these people, Robert? How are you going to fix that?
Well, the education system is a whole other issue. To me, the only way to fix the school system is with charter schools and with school choice. And you need to give the principals more power. And then if that principal's not educating children, the parents get a choice to leave and take their kids somewhere else. We can no longer tell parents, just wait, particularly urban parents who are dealing with these schools that are just... they're criminal enterprises, what we are doing to our kids. They're producing that kind of product. Yeah. If you're failing, there ought to be a market so that somebody has a choice to go somewhere else. And that's the only way that we're going to say rescue these kids. And that needs to be all of our focus. How do we rescue these children?
Do you believe that our educational system is on the brink of catastrophic collapse? Next week on Fill in the Blanks.
These issues are framed today in a way that is calculated to keep us at each other's throats. And it's like the jangling keys. It's BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They're now trying to buy housing, the residential housing, the agricultural lands. They're jangling the keys over here and say, look at the abortion issue, look at the guns, and look at trans rights. And over here, they're strip mining the wealth from the American middle class.